Hey, everybody, you are back. It is the Jack Murphy Live podcast, and I am Jack Murphy. You can find me, Jack Murphy Live, on Twitter, at Jack Murphy Live, at jackmurphylive.com. Jack Murphy Live all over the internet, actually. You can find my book, Democrat to Deplorable, on Amazon, and you can come down and check out the Liminal Order at liminal-order.com. That is our all-men's fraternal association. Come on down and check us out, liminal-order.com. My guest today is somebody I'm super excited to talk about. His name is Robby Soave, and he is an associate editor at Reason magazine. His latest book is called Panic Attack: Young Radicals in the Age of Trump. And he is a journalist who's been covering a range of issues, but including, and most notably to me in this discussion, Title IX and the evolution of Title IX over the last 10 years, and up to and including some very significant and important events that have just taken place recently. We're going to get to all of that, but Robby, sir, how you doing? Welcome. Thanks for joining me.
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. Great to speak with you.
Yeah, my pleasure. You know, we've met a couple of times, but we haven't had a chance to sit down and really talk. So I'm looking forward to it. I've been a fan of yours for some time, been following your work at Reason, and especially on the Title IX stuff, because I think it's really important. We're going to talk about all that. But as somebody myself who at one point in my life thought that I was going to be a full-time professional journalist in the traditional sense, when I was younger, my only school I ever wanted to go to was Northwestern Medill School of Journalism. I wrote for my high school newspaper, produced independent sort of zines back in the day in the 90s. I'm always intrigued and interested to talk to journalists and see how they came to their profession. So that's my first question for you is, how did you get into journalism? Has this been a lifelong calling for you? Is this something you were always interested in, or what happened?
Sure. The journalism specifically was not a sort of lifelong aspiration. I always wanted to be a writer of some kind. Since I was very little, I wanted to write stories. I was more interested in fiction, and I haven't entirely given up on the the dream of sort of moving in that direction someday. But it was in college, and then I was always interested in sort of politics and news and history and things like that. When I got to college, I became involved at the University of Michigan. I became involved with the student newspaper, the Michigan Daily. I actually joined the opinion section, and I just got more and more kind of invested and involved in what the newspaper was doing, and kind of more interested in that sort of work. That became sort of like my dominant extracurricular activity in college. So from there, it was a pretty straightforward, applying to kinds of journalism internships, and really the first one I landed actually was at Reason magazine, which I then got a job at some years later after doing some things in between. But relatively straightforward path. Definitely for people who are interested in journalism, working for a student paper and then getting an internship with a publication you like is the path that I would recommend. Is actually more important, I think, than going to a journalism school or explicitly studying journalism in college. And that's not just advice that I would give you. That's advice a lot of professional journalists would give you.
Do you think that the traditional routes of becoming a journalist and the traditional destinations for people interested in journalism, do you think those are the same as they've been in recent years, or do you think the path to journalism as a profession has changed at all?
Well, I mean, certainly the path. So to some degree, the path has changed tremendously. I mean, it hasn't changed so much for people who want to go into like a sort of mainstream journalism profession. But I mean, there's, gatekeeping has been eroded. There's all sorts of ways to just kind of do your own thing and have your work taken seriously on social media without you kind of going up through normal channels. But the kind of actually the journalism school route has always, even though it's existed, has always kind of been something that, again, that even mainstream journalists were a little skeptical of. So it's like this sounds like contrarian advice that that's the wrong path, but that's actually something that a lot of people in journalism have thought for a long time, that it's better to study, philosophy, political science, history, economics, like a real sort of liberal arts discipline. And then just because journalism isn't really obviously they have journalism schools and some very good ones, but journalism is more a craft than it is an academic discipline. If you practice it, you get better at it. So it's more, you need to be apprenticed in it rather than taught it.
Hmm.
So to some degree, that was always kind of the better route for becoming a journalist, and that's still the important route if you kind of if you want to go into a career at a mainstream publication or a newspaper.
Well, I certainly would agree with the notion that it's a good idea for a journalist to have a grounding in some other academic field that gives them a level of expertise or at least high level functioning utility of the terms and the ideas and the understanding that they may actually end up covering. I think too many times out there we see journalists assigned to certain beats that have absolutely no experience in that field, and then that leads to some interesting interpretations and qualified reporting, I think, from my perspective. But I do appreciate that perspective. What did you study at undergrad, as an aside?
I studied English literature, and I got a minor in, I think, European history. And actually took a lot of creative writing. I'm not sure how valuable a lot of my English literature classes really were, because the kind of writing they teach you in those classes, the sort of academic writing, I mean, it's unsuited to. I mean, it's really unsuited to all the writing that everyone does, whether they work in an explicit writing career or not. Like it's unsuited to writing good emails or press releases or
Right.
and certainly doing journalism. I mean, nobody kind of writes at the like 8 page, beating a thesis to death, incomprehensible academic jargon that is really taught in a lot of not just English but just kind of academia in general. But I would say that I took a lot of creative writing classes, again because I have this interest in writing fiction, and those classes I thought were tremendously helpful at improving improving the craft of writing, the craft of storytelling.
Well, you've really done a great job with that. I read your book, Panic Attack, recently, and you did a great job. You should be commended for that. I found the narratives to be engaging and the stories to be interesting and provocative, and then you were able to really deliver a whole lot of substantive information in that framework, which I really appreciated. Back, just one more question about Reason. How did you end up coming to Reason in particular? Were you drawn there because of the mission? It is a nonprofit organization. Some people might call it sort of activist journalism. What do you think about that? How did you come to Reason? How does it fit with your worldview? Did your worldview lead you to Reason? Has Reason shaped your worldview? What do you think about that?
Yeah, my worldview definitely led me to Reason. I'm a libertarian. Reason's a libertarian publication. I became libertarian, or became aware of libertarian ideas sort of in between the transition from high school to college. So it was when I was starting out at college that I was sort of first becoming aware of the libertarian philosophy and who those thinkers are, like in limited government philosophy. And I think I started becoming aware that there was a sort of network of think tanks and organizations that are broadly promoting libertarian goals. And the one that was most known in the journalism sense was Reason magazine. So I very quickly on aspired to get an internship there. And the kind of there's a professional libertarian network that was able to connect me with Reason to do that internship and to kind of be on my way. So yeah, pretty standard in some ways, but I certainly was interested in Reason for its ideas.
And do you think that Reason stands? Is there any weight to criticism that it is activist journalism, given that there is definitely a predominant worldview behind, the donors and the people, the editors, and sort of the mission? Do you ever feel constrained by that, or do you feel like you can do straight, clean journalism there without having to keep in mind sort of the mission in general?
Yeah, I don't feel constrained at all. I mean, I share the mission, so pretty wholeheartedly. So there would be no conflict there. Activist is probably not the word I would use, because to me, activism implies maybe not just advocacy, but that you're, I don't know, doing some kind of political action, like you're organizing or you're handing out flyers or you're trying to elect a candidate or you're doing something like that. And we have opinions. We're a magazine, and we're open about what our opinions are. No one would mistake us, I don't think, for a newspaper that's just kind of doing straight news reporting on a subject. Of course, we also, I mean, I talk a lot about how I think the quote unquote objective journalists who are just just giving you the facts, just giving you the news. Well, of course they have their own ideas and their own agendas and their own biases too. Many of them have very well thought out worldviews. It's insane actually to expect people not to kind of form a larger ideological conviction if they're writing about public policy and ideas in the news and what people are saying and doing. So to kind of in some ways, I find the kind of pretense of objectivity that is practiced by straight news reporters to be kind of silly. So we're a magazine. We have views about what we think is sound public policy that inform our writing. That is the background of our journalism. But we're still very much practicing good hard journalism, where we're interviewing people, we're filing public records requests for information. I think probably a way that the kind of ideology works to the benefit of of journalism, that explicitly that a libertarian ideology does, is that libertarians are naturally skeptical, naturally suspicious of authority, particularly government authority. So we don't just credulously believe everything we're told by law enforcement, by politicians, etc., and that is a beneficial approach that one that many mainstream reporters who are successful do adopt and have adopted. That's very much a good thing.
Yeah, I agree. And in my conversation I had with your colleague Elizabeth Nolan Brown a while back, she said that there is a clear viewpoint, but there is a viewpoint, but it is clear and it's explicit and it's stated, which does bring a little bit more transparency than some of these other folks who are operating with a viewpoint that they don't necessarily disclose all the time. And I find myself certainly being sympathetic to and appreciating many libertarian arguments. So I find your guys' work to be very interesting, and certainly we have a lot of overlapping interests and areas of focus. And we're going to talk, actually, that's a theme I want to touch on later, which is overlapping or common and unifying goals of disparate groups. And I think maybe you would understand why we're going to get there at some point, given that you did write the book all about activists in the age of Trump, and why and how people come together to work together towards a cause, even if they don't necessarily have all of their interests aligned. And speaking of the book, it's called Panic Attack: Young Radicals in the Age of Trump. I read it. It is excellent. I recommend it to everyone. It is available on Amazon right now. And Robbie, I wanted to ask you, how did this book come to be? What was the impetus for it? How long did you work on it? What did you do to make it happen? It's a fantastic piece, and it's obvious that there's a ton of work that went into it. So tell me a little bit about the genesis of Panic Attack.
Sure. So I would say I became interested in higher education issues when I was in college working for the paper. I found the paper's investigations into what the administration was doing very, very interesting. I thought nationally there was a lot of attention paid to education issues in general, but often targeted at K through 12, where a lot of the there's school choice. There's one category of things, kind of curriculum. There's some of the social conservatives are unhappy with what goes on in our schools, etc. Education's a big issue. I thought, and again, this is back in 2000, sort of 2008, 2009, 2010, when I was still an undergraduate. I thought higher education was very interesting, not as well covered. So I kind of early on, and that's an important thing to do as a journalist, you got to kind of broadly pick an area of specialization or an area where you think you can add something to the conversation. So I decided that should be what was going on college campuses. And for a little while, I thought that was mostly going to be actually the financial side of higher education, student loans, that kind of thing. But as my career developed, I became very interested in the kinds of cultural issues on college campuses, the free speech issues, the shutdown of speakers, the inability of certain students to hold events and to invite the kind of people they wanted to speak, often conservative students, and the kind of formal structures that were facilitating that. It turned out that the audience, and not just the audience at Reason, but before that I was at the Daily Caller, some other places, there was a lot of national interest in understanding what was going on or learning about what was going on in higher education on college campuses in an informed way. I started to think about what are the broader cultural changes that are informing this. I'm seeing I'm seeing some very interesting things. I'm seeing that college campuses, broadly speaking, have a lot of people on the left on them, and I'm seeing what appears to be a mounting sort of hostility to what I would have formerly thought of to be pretty solid leftist principles that I actually admire about the left. I'm talking about free speech and due process. I'm seeing these things come under attack from a whole host of characters, but often from a subset of the students themselves, of very liberal leftist students who are not in favor of free speech, or not in favor of free speech for controversial speakers if they don't like the speaker. And this was very interesting, and the people reading my articles thought they were interesting. An agent came to me, a literary agent, and said, "I read your writing. I think there is the material for a book here. Will you put together an outline and we'll start pitching it?" So that whole process took a long amount of time, and then writing the book took a good amount of time. I visited a number of college campuses to do. I like to do reporting. I really like to talk to people to describe their views in the language that they themselves use. I don't like to kind of make assumptions or to just generally characterize people without understanding how they characterize themselves. So I did a good amount of on the ground reporting to kind of put together a book that looks at how the activist culture has evolved in recent years, or even in the last several decades, to become less friendly to the kind of values of the old left. And I spent a lot of time on the left, but I do look a little bit at the right as well. There have been very interesting changes taking place among kind of young conservative activism. Not in the, I say in the age of Trump is the subtitle of the book. It's not necessarily all because of Trump, but it is happening during the Trump phenomenon. So I looked at how the right was changing as well. And then it came out last year. So I think it's I think these things are, I think it's important. I stress that some people make too much out of what's going on campuses. Not every small incident of a student doing something dumb or contemptible should necessarily be, I think, elevated to national platform, national attention. But when you've been covering these things as long as I have, you do start to see patterns emerge in the language the students, the young people use, particularly around concepts like safety. What is safety? Well, to most people, safety means being physically safe, being safe from danger or harm or violence. They're using it in a way that means to be affirmed and comforted in all the choices that they make. I think that's very interesting, and that's important for society to grapple with as these people leave college and go on to particularly at the more elite colleges, where these people will truly go on to affect the norms that we all have to live under, whether it's in government, whether it's in the legal profession, or whether it's working for important and influential companies that are setting the rules of how we speak to each other online, like Facebook, Twitter, etc. So that's my pitch for why I think it's very important, not just because of what it means for life on campuses.
Yeah, you definitely hit on some key themes that I've been talking about for a while now, and especially with my last podcast that I did with James Lindsay, known as Conceptual James on Twitter. He has really done a tremendous job in taking some of the theories and academic work, starting with postmodernism and then tracing it through, I think, a number of things we're going to talk about today, including radical feminism, intersectionality, trans issues, ableist issues, fat issues, things like that. And you really definitely hit on one of the key themes just there, which is there may be a minority of students on campus who are sort of like the flag bearers for these kind of movements. But as you correctly identify in your book, and just now, the advocates for these issues are in high leverage positions. It's come to control the university and academic life through federal policy, which we're definitely going to talk about. And then because a lot of this stuff is elite-based, students who then go on to powerful positions, they're then taking these ideas and then infiltrating them all throughout our entire culture, basically, universities and media and corporations all across the board. And so there is a tyranny of the minority that is taking place in some instances. And it's a way of seeing this like very high leverage behavior that these activists and these policies have in order to really change the nature even of the human relationships and things that happen in the dark behind closed doors among young people. And that's really what I want to talk about with you today. And in your book, you start off talking about intersectionality, which is something I have talked about for quite a while too. But I would like to get your take on it because I have my positions and my perspective that I have articulated through my sort of personal narrative. I spoke with James Lindsay, who gave his perspective based on the academic literature and the scholarly work. And I'm finding a really nice complement here with your work, which is sort of on the ground, engaging with the people who are engaging with these ideas. And so you may have a slightly different perspective, one that's useful and fresh for me to hear. And so I would love for you to explain a little bit about how you came even to, came across this notion of intersectionality. What did you come to find it to mean? And how have you seen it sort of play out in our culture today? Because I really think it's important, and yet it's something that, 9 out of 10 people on the street probably had never even heard of.
Yeah, so intersectionality is a word that I think you hear much more often. You think 5 years ago, almost no one would have heard what it is. Now it's something that like all young people are using. It's interesting always how young people adapt language, or how the culture of activism kind of spreads outward just to youth culture in general. And I think that's definitely happened with intersectionality. I won't define it at great length since you already talked about it a little bit, but of course it comes out of academia in the 1980s. Kimberly Crenshaw was the legal scholar who proposed the word. She needed a way to describe different sources of oppression. She was saying that, well, if you're a woman, you've been oppressed. Historically, women have been oppressed because of their gender. People of color, Black people, have been oppressed because of their skin color. So gender is a source of oppression and race is a source of oppression. But what if you're a Black woman? Then you have two sources of oppression working against you, and they kind of overlap, or they stack in a way, and they result in a more marginalizing experience for you than if you only had one or the other status working against you. And then, of course, in subsequent kind of the writings of other scholars added other categories. Class, which is actually the category of oppression that kind of predates these as the one that the left was very worked up about. But then you can have, gender, but also gender expression, gender identity. There's so many different subcategories of oppression, even in gender. Sexuality, obviously, but then also disability status, age, size, all sorts of other things. All are being under a kind of intersectional framework, are being discussed as sources of oppression that stack. So again, if it's to the extent that it's a theory, if intersectionality just means that different people have experienced different oppression based on different characteristics, and the more characteristics you have working against you, I guess the more likely you would have experienced oppression, or people. Sure, that's true. There's a sense in which it's just a mundane, obviously true observation that I don't think anyone would find that controversial. Right. So it's really not. It's not an issue with the idea of intersectionality itself, but it's become again. I've described it in the book as the operating system for the modern left. It became an activist framework. There's this tendency among kind of leftist social justice-y concepts to always be very, very hard to pin down what is meant, and then what is literally meant by it is something benign, but then it encompasses this whole set of norms for how you should approach the world and how you should interact with other people that become very, very weird and perhaps counterproductive. So it has become that if you're an activist on the left, you want to be cognizant of all these sources of oppression. It is seen as sort of wrong to be overly concerned about one and not any other. And in fact, if you're not sufficiently worked up about the oppression that every single person in one of these categories would face, then you're not intersectional. Then your contribution to the cause is not valuable. In fact, they don't want you to be part of the cause. You're an enemy. How could you be an ally if you were not dedicated to overthrowing every single one of these sources of oppression. Um, Again, it's probably fine to to want people who are fighting against racism to also fight against sexism or something like that, but since they've added so many categories, you start to get down to ones that are still a little bit controversial, even among broadly liberal people, or where we're still kind of figuring out, where I think there's it is reasonable for a reasonable person who is not like a hateful person to still kind of have some mixed feelings about how these things should work out. The sort of gender related issues or trans issues are one, and I say this as a fairly socially liberal person who doesn't take a socially conservative view whatsoever on trans issues, but there's still some difficulties to be worked out with what happens in schools and sports teams and that kind of thing, that really is not crazy or hateful at all to discuss. But the intersectional activists would say, well, because you're not with because you're not on board with what the most progressive trans activists would think about this issue, you are dead to us. We want nothing to do with you. That's what intersectionality dictates. Additionally, there's a kind of jostling for power or for authority in activist circles, where the person with the most matrices of oppression working against them is the person with the most authority. So if you are a person of color, but also a trans person, also you're poor, also you have all these other things, you are seen as being an authority on more issues because the oppressed are themselves the authority on these issues. Although also you're not supposed to ask them to speak for themselves because that further risks traumatizing them. So there's a contradiction there as well. But there's an expectation that we step back and listen to the victims themselves, victims of the oppression, and which again, that's not the craziest thing at all. Generally, probably the people who have firsthand knowledge of some kind of source of suffering probably do have something to tell us, and should be and that experience should be an additional piece of weight for why we might consider what they have to say. But an issue that I've noticed with this becomes that, well, how do you, so a competition to be the most oppressed or to seem like you're the most oppressed can have negative incentives, whereby, so what do you do if, you're just like a white dude, a very woke, very liberal, progressive white dude, but who does not fall into one of these categories? What I've realized is that mental health is itself a category of oppression. The mentally ill are oppressed. So you see this, and this is true. This is a phenomenon I've noticed, where there is a tendency to describe as the most salient thing about yourself how you suffer from mental health issues, how you're a survivor of post-traumatic stress, you're a victim of mental abuse, something like that. Where often that's like the first thing listed about activist people on their biographies on like the sort of social justice center at the university. And I think it's in a very real sense not healthy to create an incentive structure where people want to see themselves as mentally unwell. That's not good. That's not ideal. We shouldn't want people to overemphasize their life experience or reinterpret their life experiences as having been deeply traumatizing or traumatic when they actually weren't. So that's an important criticism. Again, not a criticism of simply the mere theory of intersectionality, but a criticism of how it has come to be used in these activist circles.
Yeah, I think Jonathan Haidt has elucidated this point very clearly in both his book and essay titled The Coddling of the American Mind, where he basically lays out that intersectional thinking leads people into what he deemed a victim culture and competing for status based on victim points, which is actually, and a whole slew of other reasons too, which is actually why intersectional thinking and the operationalized federal policies that came as a result are actually teaching people to be mentally ill and functioning in the exact opposite way that psychiatrists and psychologists would suggest that a healthy person behave, which would be sort of along the lines of thinking cognitive behavioral therapy, like being able to misidentify, incorrect thinking and turn it around into something more accurate. Whereas we're teaching people to actually embrace the things that are listed as a mentally sort of challenging or sort of emotionally unstable condition. And it's been not only formalized in policy. But this intersectionality approach also, as James Lindsay points out, it went from theory to application to now it's sort of been reified. It's sort of godlike. It's sort of like a religion. And if you are to attack the religion, then you're obviously a non-believer, or worse, you're an apostate, and therefore you're morally opposed to what we're trying to do, the intersectionalists, because everything that they do is morally tinged because they're all trying to look out for the greater good and to, or not the greater good, but to right wrongs and to end oppression. And while I do believe that there is some merit to giving people, understanding people's perspectives in total, not just based on one element of themselves, there is this sort of unspoken core of intersectionality, which was perfectly outlined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, where she says that white male power is implicit and understood. And so that is the problem. That's the part that becomes very problematic for people, to use their word, is that if there's all these people who are oppressed, somebody must be doing the oppression, and that oppression, that person tends to be somebody just quite like me, a white male, cis, heterosexual male, who is now squarely in the crosshairs of all this activist work. And, it's interesting with intersectionality because it sort of brings people together that have a disparate backgrounds but common goals, which is also, you can see in the response to that as well. So in your book, you talk about the critiques of intersectionality and some of the reactions to it. And I wanted to try to lay out like 3 different groups that are have like a concentric circle, or at least share some element of a Venn diagram. And there are people like yourself and like myself, I believe, that have a very legitimate, rationally based criticism of intersectionality. But then there are people who you outlined as being men's rights advocates or MGTOWs, and then you even expand that circle to say people who are like on the alt-right. All 3 of these groups have a similar critique of intersectionality and of some of the identity politics that are playing out. But they have also different goals after that. And it also makes for some very unsettling sort of bedfellows, or people who see a particular issue the same way that you do. Did you, in your experience, do you ever get that feeling that like, okay, I'm interested in covering this issue. It's a bad thing. I want it to change. But then look around at some of the other people who are sort of on your same side. And did you ever wonder, like, what's going on here? Why do I have the same viewpoint as somebody who I, clearly outlined in my book, you as being, wrong and immoral and unjust, but at the same time we have this overlapping goal? Is that a tension that you discovered in your work?
I mean, that's an experience I have all the time as a libertarian, where I'll say, as someone who defends kind of individual rights just in general, or principles or due process or something. You have, if someone with a more political or partisan might not be the right word, but as some kind of framework like that, well, they're going to defend X person or X group or X identity because they like that person or agree with them or identify them as an ally, and so they're defending them for that reason, and I'm also defending them because for what I think is principled reasons, and then I'm also going to defend people on the other side for principled reasons. But so many other people I occasionally overlap with. When I'm defending, like, I don't know, I defended Milo Yiannopoulos' right to speak at a college campus, or Ben Shapiro, although I don't with him I probably do agree on at least some things. But Richard Spencer is someone I would defend his right to speak on a college campus too, or at least I would say the response shouldn't be to invite violence against him. You should just ignore him, and he can give his remarks to like 2 people in the audience and go home and probably think it was a waste of his time. And if you're shouting these people down, I think you start to look weak, and the person looks like the martyr they always want to portray themselves as. But yes, I have often found, I think, whereas I am kind of critical of identitarianism or deriving all your meaning and all your self-worth from your membership in an identity-based group, or thinking that society would be better served by organizing around protections for groups rather than for individual rights. So I'm critical of this. When I'm criticizing them doing this on the left, when I'm criticizing identity-based political correctness or progressive diversity initiatives or something of that nature, I'm getting a lot of support from people on the right, even from people on the hard right or the kinds of the people you were referring to. But then many of them, and this is not a secret. They're very vocal about this goal. They're more just objecting to the kind of leftist orientation of these groups. They want very much group identity or an identity-based reality, but one that is more favorable to whatever the identity is that they belong to or think has meaning, whether that's white people or men, or I'm arguing right now. I don't talk about this very much in the book because it's more. I've just kind of started engaging with these people a lot more in recent weeks. But there's a whole kind of traditionalist Catholic conservative faction. You've probably encountered them in some right of center publications who seem to be having I don't know, a bit of on social media. They're having a bit of a moment. I'm just engaging with them more often, and they kind of want and are very deliberate about the regime that they want to promote to replace sort of leftist identity politics is a kind of Catholic nationalism, which I would also very much oppose because I'm for the recognition of individual rights and individuality, not identity-based associations. So the viewpoint I take just often puts me in one group or the other. I mean, today, just this morning, I finally wrote about the Michael Flynn case. This is a little bit far afield, but this is the former national security advisor who was a prosecutor for lying to FBI officials as part of the Russia collusion investigation, and now the case is falling apart. And so everybody on the right is suddenly, oh, he was mistreated, and this is horrible what law enforcement did to him. And so I agree that how they handled this case was wrong, and that it was unjust. But it's also this happens all the time. This is very much how law enforcement operates. They catch people in lies and they convict them for a procedural crime, not actually the underlying crime. This is what they do in every case. So, which I don't like, which I'm totally against. I would like to reform it. But so right now I'm agreeing with people on the right, but they're just taking this, and not everyone. I'm sure some of them have a principled view, but many of them are just bugged about what happened to Michael Flynn because he's an ally of Trump. And in fact, there will be I can pretty much guarantee there will be no vote to change the standards, the practices of how the FBI work in the long term. There will not be that reform because the criticism is really only that they've mistreated Trump people coming from the right. And then the same principle is happening on the left. Liberal people usually more skeptical of law enforcement. They'll say law enforcement has all sorts of problems or problems on racial communities, for instance. No, now we have to defend the good work the FBI was doing to hold the president accountable or whatever nonsense they're saying. So it's just it's utterly it's personality, it's tribal identity based, and that's just not the way I operate.
Yeah, me either, which is why I'm able to roll in the very heterodox circles, and I try to take a principle stand, and it definitely creates allies and bedfellows in weird places, and you end up agreeing with some people on some things and then disagreeing with them in the next breath. But I think that the theme there is consistent, which is pursuit of truth in an honest and compassionate way. And those are the kind of people that I'm attracted to, even if we have differing political outcomes or risk assessments of the same issues. But you did bring up just now an interesting topic that I hadn't planned on getting into, but it is worth getting your opinion on. You point out the contradiction, the similarities of the critiques of the process by which law enforcement often goes about getting a conviction or a plea. It made me think of the current situation with Joe Biden. Now, we're going to talk a lot about Joe Biden because Joe Biden was one of the key pushers and backers of the Title IX changes that took place in 2011, 13, 14. And Joe Biden also, was a Me Too advocate. I'm sure all of his friends were the ones that were tearing down Kavanaugh and the Supreme Court hearings and such. Trying to tear him down based on allegations that were uncorroborated, that weren't reported, that couldn't be confirmed in any way, but at the time they were demanding that Kavanaugh recuse himself or withdraw from the nomination, that he shouldn't be approved, et cetera, et cetera. And now we've got Joe Biden, who I call him the king of rape culture, because he's the one that really pushed this into our culture through Title IX, which we'll talk about. But now here he is facing, I don't know, do you consider it to be a credible allegation? Do you believe that it's something that should be investigated? And if so, how I know the answer to this question, but how are people going to respond to this on the left? And then, what does that mean for this general theme, the Me Too theme? And what does it mean for these general themes about believe all women, et cetera, et cetera? How do you see that playing out?
Sure. So obviously, I'm most interested in the accusation as a means of holding Joe Biden accountable for his bad, his pernicious advocacy of standards that have hurt people accused very much along the lines of that he's now accused, is calling out his hypocrisy, calling out what I really think was at least from the start, maybe not now, at the beginning, was unequal treatment for how the media handled this compared to how they handled Christine Blasey Ford's allegation against Brett Kavanaugh. And how did he get into all of that? As for the accusation itself, I don't, the term credible, I don't know. What do you mean by credible? Could it have happened? Is it okay? I guess, if she said he transformed into a dragon and breathed fire at me, that would not be a credible accusation, right? Because it couldn't have happened. Certainly what she described could have happened. She has given, I think, a reasonable person some reason to think it could have happened the way she said. Probably the best, it's not, I'm going to say evidence, but it's really not evidence, because it wouldn't work in a court. It wouldn't get you anywhere near establishing like a 51%, let alone a higher threshold that he did it. But that she told a friend, a neighbor, 2 or 3 years after that, and she said that it was sexual assault, and this neighbor has gone on the record and recalled this conversation, that it was actually sexual assault, and this neighbor has said, I'm voting for Joe Biden anyway, I hate Trump, but yes, Tara Reade said this happened to her, and I believe her. But even that is not, that's not contemporaneous evidence, that's not someone witnessing it, that's not some piece of physical evidence. She said that a year ago when she was interviewed by the Washington Post, she told them that there was a climate of sexual harassment in Joe Biden's office place, and her story is that she was mistreated, she was harassed, not by Biden himself, but the workplace was not friendly to women, and she was uncomfortable, and she was kind of forced out because of it. And that is an even more plausible story. It's easy to imagine the office of a senator in the early 90s or sometime before operating that way. But now she has a more a more salacious story that she was actually sexually assaulted by him in no uncertain terms. This is a long ago accusation. It's not surprising that people don't remember hearing about it. Biden doesn't remember her. I can't imagine if, and again, we're just trying this in the public square, right? Because we're not talking about a courtroom, because you could not bring an accusation like this to a courtroom. There's no evidence to establish guilt in that kind of way. So then it just becomes, if you're a Biden voter, does this make you reconsider voting for him? I'm probably not going to vote for Biden, but if I was, I truly don't think this would be enough to make me second guess that. I think if people don't think there's enough to this for them to kind of overturn a general cultural presumption of innocence, that makes sense to me. Even if I've listened to her be interviewed. I think she's empathetic. You feel for her. When I'm hearing her speak, I'm not hearing obvious red flags or like, oh, she's crazy. Oh, there's no way this happened. This is utterly unbelievable. I don't get that impression, but I didn't get that impression from Christine Blasey Ford either. So then you go to the other, well, did she tell someone? How well does she remember? All that sort of things. But honestly, the frustrating truth for long ago accusations is that kind of, it's never going to get you there to a position where you're reasonably comfortable, what happened. So in that case, defaulting to a general presumption of innocence seems to me to be the way to go. That's for the accusation itself, but then I'm happy to get into all the sort of other, yes, the enormous relevance this has to Joe Biden's history of activism on undermining the safeguards of due process in a legal sense, in a formal sense, and also just in a cultural sense.
Yes, undoubtedly, he is the king, I think, of this, of spreading this information in a structural, federally enforced manner. And I bring this up actually now thinking about Rolling Stone, right? So the Rolling Stone UVA rape hoax. I remember when that happened. I was very involved and sort of freshly involved in Twitter. And this was a really big deal when it happened. The Rolling Stone rape hoax revealed to a lot of people was a red pilling moment, as it were, for a number of people, because it laid bare so many of these issues that we were going to end up talking about in depthly, and even all the way up to this very moment, where the culture was primed and ready to just accept any accusation of sexual harassment, rape, or any other thing that a man could do bad to a woman on college campus. That when this story came out in, what was it, like 2015, it was ridiculous. It was crazy. It was over the top. It was, a group of guys, they threw her down on a glass table and the glass table shattered everywhere. And it was just this horrible gang rape that took place at a frat house, allegedly. And the world lapped it up, right? The media and the activists and everyone just lapped it up because they were primed and ready to accept this narrative. And I'm curious, this is important to me because that narrative arc, I wonder where it's going right now. And I'm wondering how it's going to play itself out, especially now that we've had the Title IX changes, which I want to get to. But you did cover the Rolling Stone rape hoax a little bit in your book. Was there anything about that stood out to you at that time? Did you see it as like a mile marker on some path? Did you know where we were heading at the time? Does it have better context now that you look back on it and sort of put it into a series of events that sort of help create this climate? What value do you put on the Rolling Stone UVA rape crisis scandal hoax thing in affecting our current conversations and perspectives on sexual harassment, rape culture, etc.?
Sure. So I reflect on it a lot because it was actually very important to my own sort of career, my own journalistic development, because I was an early skeptic of the story. I don't think wasn't the very first person, but I remember the second person. I was the first quasi mainstream person to write an article expressing some doubts about it. So then I became very associated with. I got to celebrate being right when it kind of swiftly fell apart after the initial round of accepting, and then some people doubting, and then those people being attacked for doubting, and then it all fell apart. It was very much an important moment. It was almost a more important moment in terms of sort of activist journalism, or the blending of activism and journalism, because the story happened because there was so much of kind of what victims' rights advocates believe about how their stories should be told was what formed the core of the piece. The author, Sabrina Rubin Erdely, who actually, by the way, has had this long history of doing this exact kind of piece in a different context. She had done a abuse in the sexual abuse in the military piece. She had done a sexual abuse in the priesthood of young boys piece. That actually you go back and look at some of these pieces, they look very suspect. They have the same kind of just utter faith in a victim or a witness who seems like they very much might have been making the story up. I've joked. I mean, this is a crude joke, but I'll say it. I joked that she found the one priest abuse story that seems a little doubtful if you dig into it. Like I don't generally believe that those stories are made up or wrongful accusations, but if you read this one, you might think they generally are, just from looking at the work she had done there. So she had this history that she brought to this issue of just an utter conviction that a victim telling their story is telling the truth. And if they're uncomfortable or they're unwilling or they're hesitant or they're telling you different things, that is all that makes it more likely that they're telling the truth. That's the psychology that we've been told that's part of the training, actually, in a lot of Title IX materials, that, well, if a victim has all of these problems that in any other context would make you doubt them, that probably means they actually were victimized and they're suffering trauma. And just the inability to question her or to go through normal processes, because honestly, you should have, the story should have been never would have been published under normal circumstances. An editor would have said, okay, well, but did you reach out to, XYZ people who are named in the story to get their perspective? And of course, Sabrina didn't, because Jackie wouldn't allow her to. Jackie being the victim in the story, for who the story's named. But the editors just went along with it because this seemed like a great story, huge story, important, and again fitting the narrative of how we're supposed to treat victims. Then obviously it all falls apart. Jackie, she never divulges to Sabrina who the name of the person who attacked her, who orchestrated this horrific gang rape, even though, according to the story, Jackie knew who it was. She was on a date with this guy, so she knew who he was. So that was that was one of the red flags, right? I mean, there's so many red flags. I've written about so many sexual assaults on college campuses. I could believe there would be, certainly there have been gang sexual assaults, and there have also been premeditated sexual assaults. But I was having trouble picturing or thinking at all likely a gang sexual assault involving multiple people responsible for it, that was planned out in advance, which was what the story was suggesting, that this was like some initiation rite. And the victim was not incapacitated through drugs or alcohol, which is what usually occurs even in sexual assaults that are actually taking place, because you have to have some, there has to be some haziness so that they wouldn't immediately go to the cops. So it was just, that was quite a pill to swallow. As it turned out, that should have given the writer, the editors, the fact checkers pause, because the person who then finally afterwards, she said, okay, well, this is who did it. Well, he did not exist. Messages sent from him to her friends were actually sent by Jackie. It was an elaborate catfishing type thing, which, by the way, is not actually common. What stands out about this story is that Jackie was a sort of uniquely deceptive person. Even in this sort of kind of sexual misconduct disputes that I generally cover, it's generally, we both got drunk, here's what I think happened, here's what you think happened. To like entirely fabricate a persona, send messages from that person to your friends. I mean, that's going to a level that there has to be something very wrong with you to do that. So it's interesting that Rolling Stone got ensnared by the uncommon case of the truly motivated, crazy delusional person, when actually the cases that are more common that I write about, fall in this much grayer zone of where maybe the victim consented in the time but doesn't consent now, or maybe they're harder cases. This one was an easy case, which is maybe why it turned out to be just utterly obviously false.
Yeah, it was fascinating that this case supposedly had a bunch of evidence that you could point to, or at least in the article they claim to. But then, as you're saying, most of these sexual harassment or assault cases, or not, I can't say most, many of them on campus, there would be no evidence anyway. It's just a matter of recollection and of people's perspectives, which perspective can change. Your feeling around consent can change from one day to the next, which is another reason why the sexual assault stuff gets so complicated. You did raise a couple of good points, or a number of good points, but I want to talk about a couple in that last little bit, where the Rolling Stone case highlights the very powerful yet sort of duplicitous pillars of the intersectional combo with postmodernism and into social justice and critical theories, that there's only one truth, and that truth comes from the person who's speaking it. And you can't assail that. You can't tear it down. You can't even challenge it. It is actually, in their worldview, the only definition of truth is your personal perspective, and it can't be challenged. And they call it the standpoint theory. So it's very interesting to me how these philosophies and theories have turned into application. but they've also developed a number of tools and sort of branches off of their theories that make critique of it impossible, that make challenging it impossible. And you can feel what that means when it comes to a sexual assault or a rape case like the Rolling Stone hoax, because you can't even challenge the accuser without challenging their sense of reality or truth, and you're just trying to, through questioning, you're just trying to impose your sense of your dominating sense and your power upon the oppressed here. And it's just another reason why that Rolling Stone thing just stood out so bright and loud, and red pilled a number of us on the media as well, right? Because Rolling Stone, that was a trusted news source, and there they were, like pushing some of the worst kind of fake hoax, salaciousness that you could possibly push all in this environment of rape culture, and the fact that the straight cis hetero white male is the promulgating a rape culture where they say 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 women on campus would be raped. Now that's something that I wanted to dig into with you, because the rape culture and the rape culture stats became a catalyst for the Title IX modifications, which operationalized intersectionality, became the operating system, as you say, for intersectionality, which then was how it was rolled out across the country and institutionalized. Let's talk a little bit about the rape stats and rape culture. I'm sure you've done a deep dive investigation on this. And if you could just give us a little bit of intro on that, because it's really important about how this data came to be even, and how it made it to the White House. So Robbie, is it true? Do 1 in 4 women on campus get raped at some point?
I don't think so. Of course, there are studies you could point to that have purported to find that finding. The problem immediately becomes, how are we defining our terms? You hear it's 1 in 4 and it's rape, but then if you look at, what was the question actually asked? Often you'll find that the person surveyed did not identify themselves as a victim of rape, but maybe you asked them, well, have you ever been in a position where you felt you'd had more to drink than you wanted to have, and you were put in a position to feel sexually uncomfortable? Some broader language like that. Well, guess what? A lot of people say, yeah. I mean, under that language, you might find that more people than 1 in 5 have had that experience. There starts to be a kind of slipperiness, or an identifying or asserting on behalf of people that they are victims of something that they actually don't see themselves of. Then you have other surveys that find actually women who are not in college are at much greater risk of sexual misconduct than women who are in college, or that women are of college age, because then you meet with the reality of crime statistics, where that most victims of anything, be it assault, robbery, et cetera, are low-income people. It's in the household, people in bad marriages or living in bad environments. Those are victims. Those are women who actually tend not to be in college. There's like a undue focus on the kind of narrow problems of college campuses, when there's actually a lot of reason to think it would probably when you're talking about a population of people who are very at risk of sexual violence, you would not be looking at the undergraduates of like Oberlin or Columbia or something. This is a hard statistic to pin down. There are some studies that have purported to find it, and then there are a couple other statistics that are very important for this conversation. One being the false report rate, which you hear a lot. Well, how many reported sexual assaults are false reports? And there you have everything from 40% of them to like 2% of them, which is a huge difference. Is it that that like nearly half of these kinds of reports are false, or is it that they're almost never false reports, lower than any other category of thing being falsely reported? And of course, here you find out that we have no idea, that the statistics used to arrive at this are just useless. For one thing, so the more rigorous ones that are looking at police, it's reported to police. Well, it's only going to be labeled as a false report if the police were like explicitly able to find evidence that they knew for sure it was false, which is not the length that they're going to when they're deciding whether this could be prosecuted, right? This is like explicitly determining it to be false is a whole another level. So this isn't so that's statistic that's finding like a low false report rate, but probably it's true to some. How many people are actually going out and filing false police reports? Well, I tend to think that's probably low. Again, you have to think about what's the level of deception involved. That seems extreme. I don't think that happens a lot. But of course, we're not talking about going to the police in all these scenarios. Christine Blasey Ford didn't go to the police. Tara Reid didn't go to the police. These kinds of accusations, by the way, are just kind of general, did you say something that was true or not? And of course, we have no way to determine how often people exaggerate or mischaracterize things that happened to them recently or a long time ago, etc. So there, we have no idea. And anyone who sort of asserts that, well, we should think X because this is how many reports we know to be false, you're just using statistics that are not meaningful at all. And then the other very important statistic for talking about Title IX adjudication is the serial predator statistic, which I did the most work on, where it was kind of just me looking at that. It became very popular in activist circles to think that that most campus rapists are committing, on average, I think maybe 6 rapes. They're repeat offenders. They're people who commit sexual assault over and over again. So the reason that matters is that then if someone is accused and you think it's not just that they maybe committed sexual assault, it's that if they did commit sexual assault, they probably did it a lot. So it's very important to get rid of them, to ban them from campus. Perhaps the argument for suspending due process or have something less than due process is more compelling, because the science shows that these people do this over and over and over again. Well, of course, the study, and it was just one study really, that launched that wave of thinking. It's by a psychologist named David Lesak. I looked at it in great depth with a co-author, actually, a college administrator who came to who brought this to my attention and did a lot of writing on it as well. She actually talked to Lesak briefly before he hung up the phone on her. It turned out his research had nothing to do with the problem of campus sexual assault, except in a very abstract way. He was surveying people at a commuter school in Massachusetts who just happened to walk across. And again, he was not doing this. This was research his graduate students were doing for unrelated work. Long story short, these were people describing violent acts that they may have committed, probably against domestic partnerships or their children or children of their partners, not in a campus setting, not student-on-student violence, not at all the kind of thing we're talking about when we're talking about what is happening in the dormitories at the state university or the liberal arts college or whatever. But that research was generalized to the campus population to a degree that's almost unfathomable. This is a person whose guidance has gone into, whose opinions have informed Title IX commissions, whose advice was taken by prominent politicians, who appears in The Hunting Ground, which is the famous documentary film about the problem of sexual violence on college campuses. And it really, the picture that emerges from that data is not well correlated with the actual problem. So the statistics were certainly a source of harm, but then which I think we'll probably turn to this now. The kind of we talked about the cultural issues and the statistics, the science. Of course, the explicit policy changes enacted by policymakers and government is the immediate most, we don't have to, well, what's the nebulous connection between this cultural factor and this? Of course, the government saying you have to do it this way is the most direct reason that the situation became so dire so quickly on college campuses.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me to see what happens when people start digging down on these statistics. So the 1 in 4 number, that was something that I remember being beaten over my head with. It was everywhere, rape culture, rape culture, rape culture. But you start to dig into it. You start to look at the survey. You realize that the person who's recording the survey starts assigning whether the person was assaulted or not, even if the respondent to the survey didn't think that they were. They expand the terms used to define sexual assault or sexual violence. There's just a number of ways that the numbers get twisted, and the studies turn out to be terrible. And even some of the studies that were most regularly cited said, it's right in them by the authors even, this data is not nationally representative and it shouldn't be extrapolated across all of our universities. And even in the face of total absence of corroborating data from law enforcement or FBI, people still seem to believe it because it fed into the narrative that they wanted to believe, which was that men are bad, patriarchy bad, patriarchy oppression. We gotta do something to stop all these bad men. And I see also a relationship here too with the implicit association test. That test has been debunked a number of times. Even this guy who did the study himself said it shouldn't be used to predict racism or bias. People have figured out ways to game that whole test. And yet there's a multi-billion-dollar industry of diversity, equity, and inclusion all over this country, corporations, human resources departments, that are fundamentally based on this notion that's put forth by the implicit association test. Jesse Singal, is it Singal? Jesse, whatever. Jesse Singal, who's done tremendous work on both Title IX and on the implicit association test. He's torn it apart to shreds, yet that thing still survives, still lives. I remember being in a company-wide meeting at my last job that I got fired from because I got doxxed by Antifa and called a Nazi. I remember sitting in one of the meetings and they brought up the IAT and they just started beating us over the head with it. And I sheepishly raised my hand to say, well, the guy that did that study doesn't think it can be extrapolated and we shouldn't base policy on it. And they just shot me down. That should have been a good sign for me for what was coming from them. But to carry on with the Title IX thread, Title IX and the rape culture stats you cannot separate them. And in my research, I figured out that it was basically Joe Biden. Joe Biden, the rape advocates, or not advocates, the rape culture advocates, the 1 in 4 people got a hold of Joe Biden's attention. And they terrified him with these statistics. And then, do I have this right? I'm pretty sure I believe that Joe Biden then became the primary force behind what became the 2011 Dear Colleague letter. And let's use this as a chance to segue into Title IX, 2011, Joe Biden, rape stats, rape culture, operationalization of all this fear and everything else.
Yeah, so Joe Biden was very involved. He was not involved at like the lower level planning or anything. That was the Office for Civil Rights, the bureaucrats at the Office for Civil Rights, which is part of the Education Department. I've described him as he's the hype man for this effort. He's leading the task force. He's in front of the camera to explain why these changes are great and why this is a serious problem and what they're doing to combat it is so important. So he was, which is very important to the work of selling it to the public. So he is highly involved. So the changes that come into being under the Obama administration relating to Title IX. So first, Title IX is a federal law from the 1970s that mandates that there cannot be sex-based discrimination in education, or if schools receiving federal funding cannot engage in sex-based discrimination. Later, also understood to mean gender-based. Essentially, that you can't, if there's a club or an organization in a school and it's a men's club and there's comparative interest in having a women's club, you have to fund that as well at a level equivalent to the enthusiasm for having such an organization. That's an example of a kind of thing that Title IX initially was covering. And in grad, there's always mission creep in bureaucracies, in compliance, so it comes to encompass a wider spectrum of things over time, even on its own. Some courts let that to happen, but then there becomes this major reinterpretation beginning in 2011, where the federal government is advising colleges that sexual misconduct is a form of gender-based discrimination. So if you've suffered harassment or assault or any of that kind of thing for reasons of sex or gender, as a student, your right to an equal education has been negatively affected. So then it becomes so an institution that fails to protect you is violating Title IX, and their federal funding can be at risk. So then the federal government, again, an agency of the Education Department, is telling schools, here is what you have to do, in our opinion, to be in compliance with this law that was written in 1974, or whatever exact year it was. Again, the law itself being one sentence long and just clearly not being intended to prescribe specific procedures for how a sexual assault adjudication hearing would take place on a college campus. But that is what federal bureaucrats are telling the schools needs to happen. So can
I stop you right there for 1 second? Because I think this is an important point. the Office of Civil Rights within the Department of Education, they write a letter. It's called a Dear Colleague letter. They send it to one of the universities. It then becomes the guidance by which you are supposed to enforce the law, the federal law, the civil rights stuff, the Title IX stuff. But this seems to be a very important and powerful thing that the OCR did. Is there a system by which these types of guidance letters or policy changes or policy updates, is there a system of review, of analysis, of public comment, of debate and discussion? Do these things go through a system like that? Or is this something that they just send, one guy writes a letter and sends it off and it becomes the law of the land?
So these things are supposed to go through the exact procedure you just outlined. This did not. When an agency engages in rulemaking, that is, they're coming up with a new rule that they think is covered under the existing law, but it's a new rule. It's supposed to go through notice and comment. There's supposed to be input from a variety of people, and it takes a while, and then it's implemented. If you're actually, if an agency is actually implementing a change to the law, then they can't do that. Congress is supposed to do that. That's why we have legislators. Right. We elect legislators. We don't elect bureaucrats. Right. Of course, that didn't take place. They maintained that they were not creating a new rule. They maintained, the Office for Civil Rights, they were just issuing guidance fully in line with what the law already said, the rules that already existed. So they maintained they did not have to go through any of those kinds of verifications, any of those steps. Now, so the trade-off there was that they weren't saying this is a new rule that you have to follow. They were saying, we think you have to do what we're telling you now to be in compliance with existing law, existing rules. You're welcome to challenge us, and we can go to court and figure it out, but we're telling you that we think you would lose federal funding because we're right, this is what you're supposed to do. So, of course, no school wants to make some kind of stand against, on behalf of young men accused of sexual assault to fight this. So they just all comply. And of course, the aspects of the schools complying with this are the vast Title IX bureaucracy that is more than happy to have more to do and more reasons to hire more Title IX coordinators and put it like there was very little incentive to mount a principled ideological stand against this. So of course the universities did not. The aspect of the university that did mount some resistance is, of course, the law faculty at certain colleges and universities, including Harvard. Harvard, right. Their administration has been a disaster on a level I can't even convey in words. Their law faculty was thunderously upset about this because these people come from a world, obviously these are people on the left, but who come from norms of due process, saying that the procedures being forcibly put in place are Byzantine, are horrifying. So the federal government is telling universities, colleges that to be in compliance with existing federal law, they have to investigate and adjudicate all matter of sexual misconduct much more aggressively. So there's a speech, even without the sort of due process, there's a speech component for free speech. Because they're defining, in the guidance, sexual harassment as any unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature, which is so broad. Correct. So that right. Could be, you could be discussing like a sexual assault scene in Shakespeare in a literature class and run afoul of that. It's something that makes anyone uncomfortable for any reason. In employment law, if we're talking about workplace harassment, there's limiting factors that judges have mandated, the law has mandated. It has to be severe, pervasive. It's like all those other things, so that just not every time someone is upset, it's actionable. That was not part of the guidance. That did not exist in the guidance. So you had no check. And then, of course, the norms they're recommending for the procedures, including for the sexual misconduct hearings. Actually, they're not requiring hearings. They're actually pushing colleges to move to a single investigator model where you just have one university official deciding the entire case, essentially deciding who to interview, what evidence to consider, and then proposing a sanction, proposing a recommendation, a finding, without the accused having any ability to not only to present a defense, but in some cases to even know what they're being accused of, because they're not guaranteed access to the documents. Or copies of the documents. Sometimes they get to glance at the documents and then they have to copy them from from memory. So just yeah, and we can go. There are just so many things that just fly in the face of not just due process but common sense that became an element of handling these matters.
Right. And aside from the Harvard law staff, were there any outspoken groups or anybody crying foul about this letter being sent out without a public review, or was it something that just sort of went out into the world without much notice at first?
It went out without much notice to the broader world at first. There, all along there were people, there were law faculty members, there were professors who come out of the old left. I talked about that a little bit, how I think this new left that is more hostile to free speech and due process. There's a kind of ACLU left that believes that, well, even, accused terrorists get due process. The Westboro Baptist Church gets due process. The Nazis, when they marched through the Jewish town, they get due process and free speech. So there certainly were professors who, I would not agree with them on a lot of things, but on this, they had a lot of very real concerns. And then of course there's the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, which is a free speech and due process organization, was on this immediately. I think the broader concerns, and of course I said the ACLU left is good on this, but the ACLU itself has become a little bit captured by the newer left to a degree. So so actually they have I don't know to the extent to which they celebrated the changes, but they have condemned every attempt to undo the Obama era changes, and that's been very disappointing.
Let's talk about the ACLU for a second. Since you brought them up, I happen to have that written down in my notes as well. I have a personal experience with the ACLU that's, I think, worth sharing and contextual here. When I was doxxed by Antifa and called a racist and a Nazi, my workplace, which was a federal agency, right? Because the District of Columbia was all federal, plus the District of Columbia has its own Human Rights Act, plus the obviously federal agency covered by the Constitution. And that didn't stop them from digging through, after Antifa doxed me, digging through all of my old posts and all my old tweets and everything else. And they dug up like 2 or 3 specific things that they were firing me for. And they were all politically related, right? They were like critiques of radical feminism. They were questioning whether or not Montgomery County is doing the right thing by having sanctuary cities, sanctuary county. And the legal director, Art Spitzer, in Washington, D.C. of the ACLU, reached out to me. He contacted me. He said he wanted to take my case because it was a clear violation of the First Amendment and a clear violation of the D.C. Human Rights Act. We went through a whole long process. We met a number of times. He wrote a really long paper for me to respond to my employer with. He wanted to take the case. He put it to his legal committee. The legal committee was split and rejected taking my case. He appealed it to the broader committee, and they denied my case, even though the legal director, who he claims he was the last libertarian in the libertarian wing of the ACLU, and he said to me, he said that the reason why they declined to take your case is because they did not want to offend their coalition partners. And the coalition partners that he explicitly said were Black Lives Matter and the Human Rights Campaign. And he said that they were not going to take my case, a clear violation of First Amendment rights, one that he put in like hours and hours and hours and hours of work on, that he reached out to me asking if he could take the case. And they said no. What has happened to the ACLU? We're going to get back to Title IX, but you brought it up. I want to ask you, what has happened to ACLU, Robbie?
I mean, your experience that's just a perfect example of kind of what's going on with the organization. I have to be careful because the ACLU is a big organization and they actually operate differently in every state. And they are still doing a lot of great work. So I'm not going to say the ACLU is dead or state by state, they still do. They take controversial clients. There was I think it was maybe Connecticut, or I can't quite remember state. They defended. I wrote about this maybe a year ago, a couple of months ago. Students who were expelled from posting. They were expelled after they posted. This was high school photos of themselves with like guns on TikTok, and they got expelled. The ACLU took their case, got them a settlement. Like that's great. They do terrific work still. Unfortunately, what I think has happened is they have hired a lot of employees who are younger, who I think instead of seeing the organization as like a principled civil liberties organization, see it as an anti-Trump organization or just a
Mm.
progressive organization. Um, so the things that they're passionate about are immigration rights, civil rights for for prisoners who are, or the race issues in criminal justice, all sorts of things, those kinds of things. Which again, I'm generally probably agree with them on, and I'm glad they're doing work on. But it's not as much about the kind of principle. Well, we're going to defend controversial people on the other side too. That's not how they see the organization. So I think there's now. I don't think it's resolved. I think there's a lot of internal tension about which that's the direction they're going to. I don't think it's for certain that they just like it's over. The battle is lost. That's the direction they're going. Certainly, it looks that way. I have friends. I know people inside the ACLU or like dissident people who used to be with the ACLU. They generally they have a range of opinions. Some of them are so concerned. Some of them hate what's becoming the organization. Some of them still think the organization is great and can be redeemed. But they're in a place where they're slated to just become another progressive organization, because that's what the vocal sort of young activist who works there would want, which is exactly what I kind of worry about in my book, that the capture of influential and important organizations by a small number of activist, woke, intersectional type people, who then the entire company comes to recognize and hold and explicitly advocate their view, not because there's a majority of them, but because they're the most vocal person, and criticizing them is a form of is illegally traumatizing them, according to them.
Yeah.
So no one's going to speak out against this happening when they say, well, if you're speaking out against me, you're contributing to my harassment or my lack of inequality or my right to a workplace free of violence. That's their mindset. So they're intentionally using that to weaponize their views against dissent. And that's to some degree the story of what's happening at the ACLU. Also part of the story at a lot of other institutions that have kind of let the fox into the henhouse.
Yeah, well, part of the whole thing with the critical social justice people is that they're taught that it's not enough to write scholarly papers and critique of certain ideas, but the job of the philosopher is now the job of the activist, and it's the times are done for writing papers and talking about things nicely, and it's time for actual active change. And because the active change that they're seeking is morally justified to them, to the level of a religion, many would argue, they feel completely justified in doing whatever it takes in order to enact the changes that they want to see. And they're very active in taking over organizations. Again, the tyranny of the minority, they have done a fantastic job at getting themselves into high leverage positions and then using policy and federal changes to enact even more high leverage sweeping changes. But on this one last theme about the changing arcs of our institutions as they get deeper into social justice, critical theory, postmodern, etc. We've talked about Biden's arc, where we're talking about it. We talked about ACLU. In your book, you mentioned another organization, moveon.org. You laid out a pretty interesting arc for them as well that has led them to a position that seems sort of anathema to the way that they were founded. Is that right? Did I read that right in your book?
I just think it's fine. Actually, and I brought this up in an article I wrote the other day. This entertains people every time I share this anecdote. It's just not something that's broadly known, or I guess it's not broadly remembered. But, so MoveOn.org is a progressive activism organization that, is pretty by the books, progressive leftist activism on gender and believing victims, believing women, all that, on everything. People forget, or maybe they just don't know where its name comes from. So
I didn't.
the moving on was to move on from the sexual misconduct episodes involving Bill Clinton. The people who started the organization were Democrats, were liberals trying to say we should get over this. The country should just kind of move on. Is this that big a deal? I think they advocated like censoring him, like censure by the Senate, but not impeachment or getting rid of it. This is that big. We're gonna move on. There's more important stuff to worry about. Which is, again, it's just kind of hilarious. And now that was actually entirely characteristic of how second wave feminists treated the entire Bill Clinton episode, right? The Gloria Steinem writing in the New York Times at the time, a column that very derisively became referred to later as like the one free grope rule, that like, well, he may be a kind of creepy dude who does bad stuff, but he's our creepy dude who does bad stuff. He's one of us. He's part of our team. So we're going to defend him. We're just going to overlook the bad things he did. I think there was a moment at the very height of the Me Too movement where that double standard was not being observed. So Democrats did turn on Al Franken. They did get one of their own and say, this is not okay, you have to leave. That was like the most high-minded the movement ever was. And now, of course, has lapsed back into, well, when we said believe all victims, we didn't mean people who made accusations against Joe Biden. They've totally just, well, he's one of us, and we're gonna totally. Most of them, for the most part, have said, yeah, we're gonna look the other way on this, or anyway, not that we're not gonna look the other way, but we're not gonna hold him to the same standard. The standard being all victims must be believed. Not only their standard, this is Biden's standard. Biden said at the time of the Kavanaugh incident, and this is well in keeping with the guidance that he hyped as the spearman for Title IX, that we should believe all victims. We should presume the essence of what they say is truthful, no matter how long it takes them to come forward, no matter if their stories change. We need to presume that the essence of what they say is truthful. Now he says, now that he is in the situation, he says it's slightly different. Now he's saying that, well, I meant that we needed to respect victims, but then you have an investigation, and if the evidence doesn't show you that it happened, well, then that's that. But of course, no evidence is ever going to show that this happened or didn't happen. There's just no evidence, period. And in that situation, under his previous standard, he would say that, well, we should presume the person is telling the truth. Which is different than just respect. I agree we should respect people who come forward. There's no reason to be dismissive or mean-spirited or derisive, or to not empathize with them or talk with them, in about what can be done to as resources for you. This is actually one of the great things in the revisions to Title IX that's now coming out of the Trump administration that Betsy DeVos just declared last week, is now they're saying, actually, well, universities can reach out and offer support to victims without necessarily initiating the kind of adjudicative procedure. If all they want is to be heard, listened to, and comforted, but they don't actually want the kind of courtroom sort of thing, then why not just do that? This makes perfect sense to me, and again, as part of the new guidance. But so long story short, Biden is totally under the standards he advocated. It's crystal clear. And people have been expelled for sexual misconduct on college campuses in the exact same situation Biden now finds himself in. He is lucky to not be a student on a college campus, languishing under the standards he himself advocated.
Wouldn't that be something to see him held to the standards that he held the rest of us to? One of the things that I love about a long enough timeline is that unprincipled positions get revealed as the circumstances and environments change. People's positions and attitudes change if they're not based on core fundamental principles. And it's clear organizations like Move On. Sadly, it seems as though the ACLU is moving in the same way. Obviously, Joe Biden moving in the same way. That there's no actual clear bedrock set of principles that they're adhering to. They're all actually just adhering to the principle of power, trying to get it, trying to preserve it, trying to keep other people out of it. And the hypocrisy is just completely exposed. And for somebody who may had and I don't think either one of us, but for people who may have had a less jaded perspective on government and politics and the media, these last 10 years have been just amazing at revealing hypocrisies and agendas and the motivations behind things that people are doing, even if they're saying out loud that this is a morally principled stance that they're taking, it's really not, and none of it is. And that's part of why we feel this conflict and dissonance and this unease. And it's also why when you start to interrogate somebody who has positions like these, that they tend to respond with increased agitation and anger and just a frustration, because if they can sense when you're drilling down and trying to get to the point at which one could establish a principle that they were standing behind or standing on, there isn't one there. It's all based on quicksand. And I think that the country really felt that with Title IX. It really felt that with the Dear Colleague letter. And that stroke of a pen, the policy that went out without any public review, that was sent out in the dark of the night, and ended up changing the culture. That too didn't seem to have any real principle standing, and people got really tired of it. So let's move the Title IX story along a little bit. Joe Biden, he is the hype man. He gets this the 1 in 4 rape stat. They send out the letter, goes to college campuses. College campuses all of a sudden are afraid that they're going to lose their federal funding, which is to the tune of billions, hundreds of billions, probably, right? Hundreds of billions of dollars. And they're worried that they're going to be found non-compliant. They don't want to have to go to court with the Office of Civil Rights. And in Title IX, the 2011, and I think in 13, the federal government even urges the universities to preemptively seek out and stamp out harassment and abuse. So with all of this in hand, what do the universities do? What happens? How does this unfold across the country? And what problems did it really bring to the forefront?
I mean, the universities implemented the guidance broadly to the best of their ability, and then some. The issue with federal guidance that was never subjected to any rulemaking and was just kind of made up on the fly is that it's contradictory and it's confusing, and it contradicts sort of other procedures that the universities, if they're public universities, would have to follow, like the First Amendment in many cases. So the universities are in this weird position where they have to enforce guidance that probably many of them, or some of the administrators enforcing it, know is not solid guidance or would not stand up, but they're doing it anyway because that's what the federal government is telling them they have to do. So then and also, some of them just don't have some of the administrators, if you're thinking of the vice president for, what's the joke position I always use? Vice president for sustainable, diversity and student life or something like that. These are bureaucratic type people who actually very well are probably not First Amendment experts or Fifth or Sixth Amendment experts. They're some of the things they're then telling students and professors that they have to do to be in compliance with Title IX actually go well beyond what the government told them they had to do. That's how bureaucracy works. People misinterpret things. I saw, for instance, I think the City University of New York, I saw an email they sent to professors, to faculty, warning them not to use gendered salutations in emails, like Ms., Mr., Mrs., etc. Well, so Ms. is not gendered. I don't know. They were trying to police the language they were using, something like that, and saying that if you didn't do that, you could be violating Title IX. Of course, no, that does not violate that.
Right.
That does not literally violate the wording of the statute. No court would have agreed that that was a violation of Title IX. And in fact, the guidance from the Office for Civil Rights would not have held that to be a violation of Title IX. But nevertheless, the instruction to just go more insane on enforcing speech and behavior related to sex or gender, that was the message, and they got that message. You had, you can Google me and go through my archive of ridiculous Title IX cases where, again, this is actually not the fault of the guidance. This is the fault of the bureaucrats processing it on the other end. But the guidance itself is also just fundamentally flawed in the procedures it is requiring for adjudication, and you have universities moving to just utterly reprehensible policies. Not having, the guidance is recommending against cross-examination. It is not saying there has to be lawyers. It's saying if the if the accused can appeal, then the accuser has to be able to appeal. It's saying, and then sometimes it makes a settlement document with individual schools and colleges. First, it will tell you, oh, we're investigating you for violating Title IX, and then it will later produce a document saying, okay, here's everything you were doing wrong. The first one was the one for the University of Montana, which then it is supposed to be the guidance for everyone. But then it also does a little bit of specialized guidance for individual schools and universities. I once read one of these documents where it said, well, in your Title IX procedures, this is the government talking to the school, it says we're going to do like what a reasonable person would think. Well, we're going to advise you against reasonableness. Reasonableness, that's not the standard we're going for. I mean, this is the government telling them reason. Maybe this is me as an editor for a magazine called Reason, but I find that objectionable. I have a problem with that.
Yes. That is insane. Do you think, though, I mean, just to summarize, right? Like, all of a sudden you can get kicked out of school for making an offhanded comment. Basically, you no longer have to clear a hurdle of being consistent, persistent, and prohibiting the quote victim from obtaining their college education, which was what the whole theory was based on in the first place. The level of evidentiary standard was lowered to preponderance of the evidence, which is, as you put in the book, 50% plus a feather. There was a sort of the criminalization, as it were, of things that had been ordinarily protected under the First Amendment. There was no ability for the accused to conduct an investigation or a cross-examination or face their accuser, all things that we hold to be very dear and essential parts of due process. All these things start spreading out all over the country. And you said, though, that the bureaucrats took things one step further. I think that they were probably gleefully ready and excited to do that. People that work in Title IX offices in the universities, probably not going to be right-wing, probably not going to be libertarian, probably already indoctrinated into gender studies and critical theory. That's why they're working in Title IX. So all these things work together to build a climate. And this is the part where I think it's really important, because it's not just like in the old days where when you went to school, you got indoctrinated or brainwashed, as it were, by professors in your class on a specific subject. They taught you what they wanted you to know, and it was up to you to be critical or to accept it or not. But now the indoctrination process begins in orientation. It is part of the culture on the campus. It's plastered all over the walls. There's offices all over the place. The idea that you can wound someone with words, that you can misgender people, and that is harassment. All these things are now part of the common culture because they are culturally enforced, and they're also rule-based enforced. And so this is the part that I really want to touch on with you is, please, in your opinion, do you think that these bureaucratic rules, which definitely impinged on civil liberties, which were definitely based on flawed data, which were definitely pushed in the middle of the night without any public comment, one can make an argument that that was strictly a procedural thing, a bureaucratic mess of laws that could be changed. But the argument that I make, and I think I'm interested to hear your take, is that this not only changed those rules, but it changed culture. It's changing people, changing relationships that people have, the nature of their relationships, the way those relationships are conducted. And then when you go to school in this environment, it's now been 10 years, you that stuff sinks in, and then you bring it to your next job and you bring it to your next endeavor. And so what do you think about that? To what extent is Title IX, the Dear Colleague stuff, what extent does the negative effect go beyond just the civil liberty elements and the procedural elements, but actually spill into culture and the way that we form our relationships and basically, the identity of our young people coming out of these systems?
This was affecting the entire living experience of being at a university, particularly if you're talking about one that's residential that has dormitories, that kind of thing. You make an important point. If it's, the right has often said that, the professors are indoctrinating the students or, that kind of thing. I've actually found the professors in general to be more open-minded and interesting than the bureaucrats, the administrators. And that's the other thing. You can, if your professor has a different view than you, most of the time, I'm sure there's plenty of exceptions, but you can genuinely challenge them. Actually, a lot of even professors who are hardcore ideological, like Marxists or something, right? They often like the conservative student. They like to argue or something. Many of them get into it for that kind of discussion. Not all of them. I'm sure there's plenty of cranky faculty members, but oftentimes the classroom is at least a place where ideas are exchanged. Now, people with dissident views often think they can't speak up in the classroom. I'm sure some self-censoring takes place, although studies have broadly shown that they are safe to speak up in classroom, or at least the teacher is not going to retaliate against them. The problem is some other student might file a complaint. Or a residential advisor is going to file a complaint against you because that residential advisor has been trained that if someone has a view in the dormitory on the floor that makes someone else feel uncomfortable, it might be a educational equal opportunity problem. So the kind of bureaucratization of just living and being a human being on a college campus that was very much a part of how Title IX has been handled by these administrators, by an incredible number of administrators. Let's recall, I mean, you want to know where your tuition is going. The ranks of the administration have increased, so dramatically in the last 30 years. Faculty salaries have not budged. It's the amount of administrators and what they're being paid. They're being paid to engage in a form of indoctrination, if you want to call it that, or to weeding out dissidents or different thinkers and making everyone else feel like, well, I may not agree with this activist person, but I am better off not speaking up. It's not that I fear my professor or something that they disagree with me. It's that I feel like I am required to agree in order to even be allowed to live here. And I think that will have and is having an effect on the broader society moving out of campus in deciding that speaks to the erosion of what safety means that I spoke to earlier. Again, if safety means and it goes to fundamental rights, it goes to free speech. The Supreme Court has a long history of adjudicating, this speech is allowed. This speech pointing at a specific narrow category of speech, like actual threats of violence or planning violence, or a couple other things, that is not okay. Everything short of that is okay, but that's not the standard these young people have been socialized under. They've been socialized under a standard where if your speech causes me to feel emotional discomfort or pain, then I have a right not to feel that way, and I have a right to take action against you. There should be action taken against you to prevent you from making me feel that way. The role of the authorities in society is to protect me from feeling that way. And that authority could be the campus administration if we're talking about on campus. It could be, maybe it's the employer if we're talking about the private sector. Maybe in some abstract sense it's supposed to be the government. I mean, these are, I think, very concerning trends if you're a libertarian like me, or really if you're just kind of a person who believes, you don't have to be a libertarian, you could just be a person who thinks norms of free exchange and free expression are somewhat important. This should be very concerning that we will all be forced to live under the rules of a kind of rules inspired by a Title IX-esque compliance at elite college campuses, because the people who formed their ideas about how society should be organized were lived under that regime, and now we will live under theirs.
That is such an eloquent way of saying it. You encapsulate most of my fears and concerns there, aside from the due process stuff, the cultural impact. Thank you very much. That was very clear, Bobby. There a lot of people point to 2010 to 2012 as a time period in which there was, quote, a significant change. James Lindsay pointed it out in his book, Cynical Theories, which is a fantastic book. The Pew data shows that there was a sudden change in folks' understanding of racial antagonism. Some of the questions that they've been asking people for decades, the responses which they thought would indicate a sense of racism had been declining. And then all of a sudden, 2010, 2011 takes a sharp turn. And all of a sudden, more people think, what's the question that they always ask? Black people would be better off if they just worked harder or something like that. Like the response to that, they said, is indicative of an increase in racial antagonism. There is an explosion in search activity around intersectionality, feminism, racism, and stuff around 2010, 2011. I felt it personally just in the culture. I want to nail it down on Title IX on the DCL, but what do you think about that? Do you see in your research a shift in racial antagonism or people's thoughts of on the current state of racial affairs in the United States? Do you see any change in the data around that time period? If so, what do you attribute it to? And is there any way that the Title IX DCL compliance and enforcement had anything to do with that?
It's very tough to judge. What are to first determine that something has happened, and then look, well, what are the sort of nebulous social causes that might have prompted it? I think I get the feeling that sort of identity-based antagonism might be rising abstractly. I think now you wouldn't see it. We often hear there are more hate crimes. This is talked about. This is actually something else I read about a lot, that there's more hate crimes against various identity groups. But then if you look at the data, you find out that, well, there might have been more hate crimes reported than last year, but it's just because different agencies reported, or different agencies were required to report. Actually, maybe more people reported this year, so then better data just looks like something's getting worse. So like this is a problem we have. Actually, we're seeing this a little bit right now with the pandemic. You see, oh well, we have more cases, and then you go, well, actually, we're just doing more testing. Or I mean, it might be that we have more cases, but it's not the clear. It's not just the raw number going up doesn't tell you what you need to know, and that's been true
Right.
for hate crimes. I think there's been we have to look for things that like are actual changes. So social media did not exist broadly to nearly the degree it does now before 2010. So it is true that there is now a way for people to express their views and to sort into like-minded groups. So if you held maybe antagonistic views toward one race or another, 15 years ago or 20 years ago, you might have thought you were alone and you had nowhere to express that view. But now you can see that other people are expressing it. You can group yourselves together. I mean, this goes for you could say this of any sort of a group of people with uncommon views. I think they've been able to make themselves more known, or they're more noticeable now. But it's not really that the membership has gone up. It's just that there's kind of more. There's a better vehicle for organizing. So then that makes it look like we have this rising phenomenon, for instance, of the alt-right. When I don't know that it might be like trivially true that it like literally people who describe themselves that way did not exist previously, but they did exist. They just didn't describe themselves that way, and they didn't like hang out together. They didn't know who each other were, and they had no national spokesperson. Do you know what I mean? So it's not that like racism has necessarily gone up.
Right.
I do now. The kind of so then can you measure like, well, has like sensitivity gone up? Has the I'm even trying to trace, well, is it actually true that students are getting worse on like free speech issues, or young people are getting worse on free speech issues? And it matters it matters what question exactly you ask them. Older Americans test very badly on free speech depending on how you ask the question. The kind of average of the polling that I can find does show that there is some degree of a mounting hostility to principles I think are important among specifically the college age set. But it matters. You can go back to 1970, and again, it matters how exactly you ask a question. You could get a result that would look more sinister than you get now. So it's so, and then I suspect, I guess at any rate, the kind of safety culture that came into being in the 1990s has something to do with what's happened on college campuses. That you have those people are finally coming of age. The people who were born or very young children under a time where we got like really freaked out about shootings and kidnappings related to school, and crime bill, and we have to like like really bullying. If kids get bullied, they'll turn into mass shooters. That kind of whole movement of like, oh, we got to watch and vigilantly protect and control our children, and everyone gets a participation trophy because if you're depressed, you'll probably become some suicidal maniac. That kind of mindset that came out of the 1990s, I think I suspect had a negative impact on a lot of young people, some young people at any rate, and might speak to some of the issues they have now. But then that's just that. But that's just my theory. I can't. There's no data I can point to say, yep, that's why. It's a theory that Jonathan Haidt has as well. But I never like to lead with it or overhype it because again, it's just a theory and I don't know.
So it's all the boomers' fault.
Well, yeah, right. Everybody, instinctively knows that to be the truth, right?
Right. That's exactly right, because they were the ones doing the parenting at that time. Then they were the ones setting the laws at the time now, and they're the ones that are causing all this problem. Ha ha ha. Who knows? Maybe it's true, maybe it isn't, but there's been clearly a change. There's been clearly at least a change in the conversations and in the narratives and then in the reaction. And then these hyper empowered tyrannical minorities are now equipped with tools by which they can spread their narratives and their ideas in a much more forceful and impactful way. You combine that with the teaching that they get in critical theory that they have to make change and just talk about it. And all of a sudden, you have sort of a whole recipe and a whole just a stack of things on top of each other that it has led to this moment that we're at right now. So I'm ready to start bringing this into the home stretch here, Robbie. And I want to just remind my listeners, one of the fundamental reasons that I voted for and was vocally in favor of electing Donald Trump in 2016 was for this particular issue, was for Title IX reform. I found a tweet of mine from May of 2016 where I said, if Donald Trump gets elected, he will solve the Title IX crisis and save our boys. And it became, I'm not going to say I was a single issue voter, but I certainly had a small handful of issues. And most of them were around fighting, what I see as a departure from Western values and Enlightenment values in science and reason, and towards postmodern based values of activism, radical feminism, etc. And Title IX, DCL, was one of the ways that all that stuff was operationalized, put into practice, had a direct impact on our youth, on our culture, and now on our corporations and such. And for somebody like me, I'm looking at these things as a system, and I want to see how can I disrupt this system, which I'm opposed to. And reforming Title IX was probably my number one operational goal. And it just so happens, and this is why we're talking, last week, Trump's education secretary was able to finalize their remedy or revision of the Title IX guidelines and procedures. And so why don't you take us through that? Take us through Betsy DeVos coming in, the charge that she was given, the process that she went through. Did it go through public scrutiny? Did she follow standards for implementing new bureaucratic rules? And then bring it home for us and let's have a little celebration, because I know you've been on this for a long time. I know it's very important to you. It's very important to me. And it really felt like something momentous happened in this arena in the last week. So let's celebrate that. Let's take it home. What's the final story here?
Yes, it's taken a couple years because the Secretary of Education did go through proper procedures, did do rulemaking and comment, did seek input from all sorts of interested stakeholders. She did everything by the book, which means it's taken a while. But last week, she announced the revisions to Title IX, undoing. So she had already canceled or rescinded the Dear Colleague letter, the bad advice, but now she has announced the kind of the new policies, which go a good amount toward re-enshrining some semblance of due process and basic fairness. She is now saying there has to be a hearing. The representatives for the accused and the accuser, their lawyers or representatives, need to be able to cross-examine each other. So there needs to be actually presentation of evidence. So that's a good thing. There's been some of those limiting factors I talked about are explicitly in the new rules. So it's not just any unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature. It has to also be severe, pervasive, etc. for sexual harassment. For kind of the general sexual harassment conduct, it's still quid pro quo harassment if a professor says, I'll give you an A if you sleep with me, that's still under the existing, you can't do that. That doesn't need to rise to a level of severe pervasive or something. But there's a lot of good guardrails being put back in. Also, and I mentioned earlier that you don't have to initiate a Title IX investigation if the victim doesn't want that. I mean, that was happening under the existing
Right.
guide. Like, this was a poorly understood aspect. I covered cases where the alleged victim, the purported victim, had not complained. Like, this is something people didn't understand. The investigation was not necessarily being initiated by the victim, because the victim was technically the victim, but really the victim was the university in a sense. They're the ones who are going to be punished for not complying with Title IX. So they were
Right.
investigating some cases where the victim said, nothing happened to me. Sometimes there was a boyfriend and girlfriend, and a jealous friend or a neighbor or a coach or something reported it, and the accused said, no, nothing happened. I don't want this to go forward. And the university said, excuse me, we will determine if there has been a violation. You don't determine that. We determine that. And they didn't call the victim as a witness, and so what happens? The person's found guilty and expelled. Like, again, I think every person on earth would say that was insane and unfair, and that happened multiple times. So now there's less of a burden, less of an obligation under the new rules, for the university. They don't have to initiate if it's not what the victim wants. If the victim wants something else, just to be supported, just to have resources, you can do that. Now a victim, and also now a victim could confide in a faculty member, something like a coach, and talk about it, and it wouldn't immediately trigger an investigation and a the whole all that stuff, unless that's what the victim wanted. And I think that's important. I want to give victims agency, like that. That's what the
Right.
movement says they want. Um,
Right.
so to recognize that the kind of confrontational procedure is not always in everyone's best interest. So explicitly under the new rules, also, if the accused and the accuser want to do something other than the formal adjudication, if they want to reach some other restorative justice, kind of some other agreement, they can do that. If both of them agree, they can do that, which I also think is good. We should, like, what is the downside of offering people options, and if they both want that option, why not do that? So there's a lot of good. This will not solve the problem entirely. You will still have a problem of rogue Title IX agencies continuing to operate under the bad standards. And in fact, many university presidents have vowed to do business as usual. It's possible we're going to have to go to court over this. Joe Biden has vowed to undo it the second he's made president, if that happens. So we're definitely not out of the woodwork, but this was a very positive step that I was glad to see taken, that certainly would not have happened under a Democratic administration, and it's possible it wouldn't have even happened under a different Republican administration. I say that as someone who is no fan of I like some of the things he's done. I criticize him plenty of other times. I think this is certainly one thing I can point to that I really wholeheartedly support, that goes so against the grain of what the pressure to do was, it might be honestly unique to this administration that they actually took this on.
And that is fantastic and something that should be worth celebrating. From my perspective, I understand why it's unsavory to perhaps praise Donald Trump, depending on where you sit. But like I said, I believe that this was something that he would take care of. I said it even before he was the freaking nominee, I believe. And he has finally carried out my dream, my vision. It's literally, it was 4 years ago that I tweeted that and saw this as a possibility and something that I was hopeful would happen. And I think it should be repeated that Betsy DeVos, she followed the rules, she followed the customs, she followed procedure, she went through public comment. And so she and Trump together, working together, moved our nation back towards rule of law, due process, freedom of speech, and away from these unfounded, unprincipled, postmodern nonsense, 1 in 4 rape bullshit. And I, for one, am very excited about that. And Robbie, you should be commended, sir, because your tireless work on this matter, your detailed reporting, the traveling that you did all over the country, the book that you've written, the speeches you've given, the talks you've attended, the podcasts you've done, all that adds up, and it all adds up, and it gets in people's ears, and you know, you had influence and you helped steer the narrative. And I think that you should be feeling really good about yourself and your work in this particular matter. Like, how does it feel? How does it feel that all this time, all these years later now, that all this thing that you've been so focused on and spent so much time on has actually, you know, at least taken steps towards being remedied? How does that feel?
It feels great, and this is one of the benefits of being an explicit opinion-based journalist and reporter. Is I can be honest about the fact that, you know, when I wrote on about these stories of people, often young men, who were you know, punished under procedures I thought were totally unfair, often in cases where I thought they very likely didn't do it, or they were mistreated even if they had done it. And I felt for them, and I felt, you know, I covered cases where people's lives were you know, truly ruined. It ruins your life to get expelled from college, to be some of these cases I've covered involve these people are still in debt they will never recover from after having been expelled from a university for sexual misconduct. And I
Right.
think their stories are really sad. And it's been my I thought it was important to tell their stories, and that not a lot of other people, especially not a lot of other people who have some connection to and credibility with mainstream journalism, were telling their stories. And so I've wanted to do that. I'm glad that I have done it, and I am very happy that it helped, that it contributed in some way to revising these procedures, so that they'll be, even if they'll be a little bit more fair next time. I think it's an achievement.
You're absolutely right. Things happen in our country generally incrementally. Changes found on the margin. Changes are made in bureaucratic actions and rule changes. And so this is how we do it in America. And it worked. And we're here. And who knows if Biden gets elected, what he'll be able to do given the public comment and process that this all just went through, and the light that you have continued to shine on this matter. Thank you very much, Robbie, for your work on that. Thank you very much for coming to talk to me about it. I'm really happy that we had this conversation to put everything into context. It's been a pleasure to speak with you and to get to know you a little bit better. Everybody out there, please go buy Robbie's book. It's called Panic Attack: Young Radicals in the Age of Trump. You can also find Robbie at reason.com, and you can find him on Twitter. Robbie, what's your Twitter handle so people can find
Just
you?
my name, at ROBBYSOAVE.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Robbie. Congratulations to you, and you know, thank you very much. And I hope that we can do this again sometime.
Yes, terrific. Thanks so much for having me. It's been great talking with you.